My name is Frédéric Landragin. I work as a researcher at the French CNRS in linguistics and natural language processing. I am also a reader of science fiction books. Let's talk about speculative fiction to be less restrictive. And my role today is to begin the presentation of our submission with Yanis Haralambous and Handa. Our work deals with grapholinguistics in speculative fiction, and our talk will have three parts. A foreword that lets me introduce the context of this work, a main part with the description and illustration of the main methods that we identified, and the usual conclusion and future work. So you know that scientists have already sent messages to aliens, if they exist, of course. There are the famous examples of the Pioneer plaques, the Voyager golden records, the Arecibo message, and then the Eupatoria messages, Cosmic Call 1 in 1999 and Cosmic Call 2 in 2003. With the related research on a universal language that can be understood by everyone, aliens included, of course. This research led to LINCOS, that is Lingua Cosmica, and efforts are currently being made to develop a better LINCOS. The aim is to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence, and an important point here is that speculative fictions writers have imagined a wide variety of communication situations long before the real scientific attempt. So let's take a look at some famous speculative fiction novels, and we will then focus on grapholinguistic aspects. First of all, here are two examples of illustration of the ideas from Noam Chomsky. For Chomsky, we are born with the ability to handle language, and certain structures would be innate. Chomsky focused on syntax, but many writers of speculative fiction have understood the main idea and applied it not only to syntax, but in fact to all aspects of language. These two novels, The Embedding by Ian Watson and Total Eclipse by John Brunner, are two excellent examples, among others. Another theory that was a lot exploited in speculative fiction is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that is, the structure of a language affects its speaker's world view or cognition, and thus people's perceptions are relative to their spoken language. For Sapir and Whorf, the idea can be called linguistic relativism. Our language influences the way we perceive the world, the time or the colors, for example. But for many speculative fiction writers, the temptation to go through with the idea was too strong. Thus, they moved easily from the weak hypothesis to the strong hypothesis, that is, to linguistic determinism. Our language determines our mental structures. Consequently, these mental structures are changed when we learn a second or a third language. When researchers begin to dissect works of linguistic fiction, especially when they are linguists, they tend to point out errors and exaggerations. The remarks that we will be led to make do not in any way constitute criticism of the work of writers of speculative fiction. On the contrary, even when we are a little critical, one must not forget that narrative takes precedence over scientific plausibility. What is more, the great majority of our remarks tend to show the accuracy of intuition and, in any case, the broad scope of these writers' imaginations. So, linguistic determinism is an interesting idea with many potential applications. In the languages of Pao, the government of a society that is losing a war has the idea of forcing its people to change their language. The new language, more aggressive, especially in its morphology, should allow a reversal of the situation. In Babel 17, a civilization receives coded messages from extraterrestrials. But is it really a code? In fact, it is a language which, according to linguistic determinism, transforms those who learned it and turned them into traitors. This is an original materialization of an alien invasion. This way of forcing people to learn a language in order to force them to think a certain way is a facet of totalitarianism. This is the whole message of 1984 and long before that of We by Damiatin, which describes a society where people have to think collectively and are therefore forbidden to use the first person in singular, only in the plural form we. Closer to our concerns about the ways in which speculative fiction writers have played with words and metatextual aspects, let's take two first examples. You are all familiar with Tolkien's novels and the importance of the Elvish languages in them. A French writer went ever further, publishing two novels, Word First and Word Second, in which the left-hand pages are written in the Word language, which he imagined in Tolkien's way, and the right-hand pages are its translation, easier to read for the reader who does not want to learn the fictive language. The second example, which is an extreme case too, is the book From the Ground by Xu Bing. All the novel is written using pictograms. No use to translate. We are here near a kind of universal writing system, maybe for humans only, not for aliens, perhaps. Universality is a vast question. It should be noted that in France, research on the origin of languages and on the universal language was banned in 1866 by the Société linguistique de Paris, Linguistic Society of Paris. New research has been taken place for several decades now, but it is much more multidisciplinary in its approach and much more careful too. This screenshot is taken from the Arrival movie. Well, now you all know who's behind the language advice that made this movie great. Let's just note that the film brilliantly deals with Chomsky, whose portrait can be seen in the office of the heroine Louise Banks, with Sapir-Whorf at its extreme interpretation, otherwise nothing would happen to Louise Banks, and in fact, with everything that can turn a speculative fiction into a linguistic speculative fiction, or shorter, linguistic fiction.
Frédéric has presented the interaction between linguistics and speculative fiction. What characterizes speculative fiction as a category of fiction genres is that they transgress laws of nature or of logic when describing the world. We argue that this transgression of natural and logical laws on the narrative level is sometimes combined with transgressive graphemic and graphetive methods. To study this domain, we've performed an inventory of cases. This is, of course, work in progress. And we attempt to classify these cases in categories. And these categories range from purely graphemic, involving lexical or morphosyntactic aspects, to purely graphetics, from the level of the individual grapheme to the level of the entire page or the entire book. In this presentation, we will present the current status of our classification together with some characteristic and sometimes very interesting examples. So let me show you the current status of our classification. So we subdivide graphemic and graphetic methods in speculative fiction in 6 categories: dialect, annotation, grapheme creation. Besides grapheme creation, one can consider innovative new use of pre-existing graphemes, but this is something we don't have the time to cover in this presentation. Variation of typographic parameters and typographical arrangements. So let us see examples and details of each one of these categories. Starting with dialect. Dialect is the representation of variations, which can be regional, dialectal, or variations of other kinds, as we will see, by non-standard spelling, with usually a nomophonic result, but not always. Our first example, which is the most famous one, is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, where we have a novel, the narrator of which is mentally disabled with an IQ of 68, quite low, and undergoes an operation, gets his IQ increased until a very high amount, and then at the end of the book regresses again to his previous state. And the level, the intellectual level of the narrator is given by dialect, by spelling, non-standard spelling of words. This book has been translated in many languages, and we have gathered quite a few translations, and with the help of many collaborators are analyzing them, and we are going to compare these translations in various ways. We have taken just the beginning, so from March 4th to April 8th of the book, because we consider that afterwards the orthographic aspect of the text is standard, and also the end of the book when he regresses to his previous low IQ condition. So here you can see in the English original text the amount of errors of different kinds, and also polynomial fit of this, showing clearly the decrease and then the sudden increase at the end. To give you some examples, in English you have missing apostrophes and misspelling of words, which happen to be homophone. In this table you can see the occurrence of errors and then the occurrence of the correct version. Sometimes it's quite early, sometimes it's at a later stage. In French, you have missing diacritics and missing dashes, and also morphological misunderstandings, since here you have a personal pronoun and a verb which is given as a single word. In German, you have homophone errors which show linguistic incompetence, for example, ignorance of the rule that a double consonant will shorten the previous syllable, so which is not the case here. Also errors of capitalization. This is a noun, so it should be capitalized. In Spanish, you have lack of the etymological H in words like a, había, hecho, hacer, and missing accents showing the stress of syllables. In Russian, again, you have specificities of Russian phonetics. So, for example, that the letter ch is pronounced as sh for these words at the word begin, and the phenomenon of akanye, where an unstressed O is pronounced A. So these show the linguistic incompetence of the narrator. We're going to study many aspects of this corpus, not just as a single text, but as various translations of the same text with various mechanisms of dialect. Phillips, in this short story, Lost Memory, gives the example of a world of robots, a robot civilization founded by a computer that wants to erase all memories of humans. So all words that are specifically related to humans have been erased from the robot's memories. And when centuries later a human appears in this world, he communicates with the robots, but some words are not understood. So they are not semantically matched by the robots. And this is given by misspellings in the text. So dialect is used to show that some words are not understood by robots, like woman, man, blood, death. Banks uses dialect for one of his four narrators in this book, Fearsome Engine. And he's an adolescent and writes in a way which is premonitory of SMS spelling. Not too bad, would have to be the fact I don't feel. Not only is there this narrator, Bascule, writing in this way, using this dialect, but he also interacts with a lisping sparrow. For there you are with Bascule, isn't it all terrible? And with a hissing sloth. I quite understand your anguish, young Bascule. Damasio, a French author, uses dialect to identify narrators. So here, contrarily to Banks, the narrator change is not explicitly marked. And it is by these allographs used by Damasio that the reader can figure out which is the current narrator. So Damasio has taken Latin alphabet letters and has diacriticized them to form allographs. Here you have all cases and their frequencies. And sometimes he even uses Greek letters and also a Cyrillic letter, the Ukrainian G with the upper serif. There are 6 narrators. Some of them have specific allographs, and some allographs are shared by more than one. Here you have examples. Saskia will use letters with brief, like in Romanian, and in Esperanto H. Ner will use the Icelandic and Croatian D with bar, and the H with bar from Maltese, and Tony will use Greek letters, Tau and Omicron and Epsilon. Silverberg uses iDialect to avoid censorship. So he wants to write obscenities, the 4-letter F word, and writes it in ASCII binary code. Why? Because it's a robot psychiatrist who is depressed and thinks he's a human. And this is 11 years before Marvin in Douglas Adams' A2J2. The second category after iDialect is annotation. So annotation is for us the existence of semantic or discursive dipoles, where you have the annotated text segment and the annotation content. We consider interlinear annotations and footnotes, which are formally a different kind of annotation. Torishima uses annotation with kanjis. Now, you know that in Japanese you have kanji, logographic, not only characters from Chinese origin, and they are frequently annotated by Ruby or Furigana. Interlinear annotation of these characters giving phonetic realization and intended for audiences for which the kanji per se is not accessible. Ateji is a transgression of this method by giving more than just phonetic information on kanji characters. Here you have an example. You have 3 kanji characters, which I call ABC, the last 2 of which have the meaning entrails. The phonetic annotation, seizobotsu, is not representing ABC, but AB prime C with a different kanji in the middle with the meaning of product. So the reader seeing simultaneously base characters and the annotation will combine the semantics of entrails and product into something like artificially produced entrails. So we have construction of a new meaning, and this has been translated in the English translation of the book Synthorganic. Here we have a second example of this case for the word subaltern ape, combining primates and slaves. And a third very interesting case where you have more than just phonetic realization, you have phonetics and the word modoki, which means imitation. So what happens here is these 2 kanjis have no Japanese word associated with them. But in the annotation, you have first kekkan, which can have the meanings blood vessel, fault, or missing volume. And the kanji writing of blood vessel consists of 2 characters which look very much alike these, the original ones. And in fact, the original ones are simpler versions of these. You see, take this character, remove the small stroke, and you get this one. Now, the word modoki means ersatz or imitation, simplified imitation. And so we can understand this as this being the simpler imitation of blood vessels. So the meaning of the dipole, base characters plus annotation, could be an imitation of blood vessel, and it has been translated as blood sedge. Cortázar uses interlinear annotation to illustrate simultaneity of thoughts. So here, while writing this, the narrator thinks, why is the moon full? And here there is no mention of moon. This happens again on the next page. He again thinks of the moon, and then 2 pages later, there is mention of the full moon, of which he had thought of previously. And now he thinks, I should better not mention moon at all. So there is this interaction between thoughts and narration given by interlinear annotation. Ballard uses footnotes in a very special way. He gives an 18-word long short story, here it is, and attaches a footnote to each word. And the narrative thread of the story finally lives in the footnotes. Our third category is grapheme creation. So we do not consider artificial alphabets like Tolkien's or Klingon's. What we are interested in is really use of a grapheme inside the text with a specific purpose. Our first example, Wilson has written this story. You see this grapheme. I cannot name it, I cannot pronounce it. It has neither phonetic realization nor name. But it's the title of the story, and it's a grapheme representing a morpheme, which is used and syntactically plays the role of a noun. So it's used 16 times in the short story. And the particularity is that it has 10 allographs. Here's the first allograph, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th. So as you see, it evolves. So the same grapheme has allographs evolving and simulating the growth of a living organism. And this is the idea of the story. We find out that it's a living organism which also is carnivore. Fusa Obi is the Japanese translator of Flowers for Algernon. So she had to obey the constraint of the book, the constraint of high dialect denoting the IQ level of the narrator. And among other techniques, she used grapheme creation. So she has created these 2 kanji characters, which do not exist in Japanese. They have no reading. She took, so these 2 characters represent these 2, reading and keep record. In both cases, you have the left component, which is a simplified, it's a simpler version of the left component of the correct spelling. The left component is the semantic one. And the right component, the phonetic one, is correct. So again, we have this homophonic function where the semantic component is erroneous and graphically simpler than the correct semantic component. And this is reminiscent of Xu Bing's book From the Sky, where we have an artistic performance with 10,000 pseudo characters like these, so characters with no reading in Chinese. Our next category is variation of typographic parameters. One of the parameters we can play with is color. Michael Ende in the Neverending story uses color to denote the narrative thread. So he has two worlds, two narrative threads, the real world and the imaginary world. Green color is assigned to the imaginary world and red color to the real world. And here on this diagram, you see the use of green and red color throughout the book. There are two climactic moments in this book. The first one is when the protagonist, Bastian Balthazar Books, goes from the real to the imaginary world, and the second one is when he returns. Now, usually in the book, color changes on the paragraph level. So you have a paragraph in green followed by a paragraph in red without indentation. This happens quite often when we have interaction between the two worlds. But at these two climactic moments I mentioned, you have a different technique. In the first case, you have a sentence which is broken between the two graphical paragraphs, and this sentence changes color. So here it says, the storm wind came roaring from afar. It's in green, so this storm wind exists in the imaginary world, and blew from the pages of the book that Bastian was holding in red. So now the storm wind has passed from the imaginary to the real form, the real world, and therefore has changed color. At the second climactic moment, near the end of the book, Balthazar returns to the real world, and this is given by repetition. The same sentence, Father, I am Bastian Balthazar Books, where he finally has found out his real name and is shouting his name, is given first in green. So now he's still in the imaginary world. And then in red, we know that he has returned to the real world. Another typographical parameter is font, typeface. Alexandre Jardin, in this book, Le Petit Sauvage, shows the transformation of an individual. And this transformation is connoted by font change, switching from serif to sans serif font. And from that moment until the end of the book, the font remains sans serif. Mandanipur, an Iranian author, uses Roman bold and crossed out bold for three narrative levels. The first one is the standard narrative of the author addressing the reader. And the second one is a novel written inside the novel. So it's the novel written by the narrator. And since this novel aims to be published in Iran, it has to go through Islamic censorship. So here you have an example. This is Roman, then this is part of the story. And you see some words or sentences are crossed out. And what is interesting is that when you remove these censored words, you get another story with a different narrative thread, and of course, much more innocent and avoiding events and situations which are not allowed in an Islamic environment. The last category we will consider in this presentation is the one of typographical arrangements. So typographical arrangements exist from antiquity, Renaissance, Rabelais has used them, and Tristram Shandy and others have used typographical arrangements. In the late 19th and early 20th century, we had Mallarmé with Un jeu de dés jamais n'abolira le hasard, and Apollinaire with his calligrams. And later on, we had visual poetry movements, the lettrism, artistic movement, and so on. Now, in speculative fiction, typographical arrangements have been used for specific purposes. Our first example by Claude Ollier, Fuzzy Sets, is a book entirely typeset in typographical arrangements of 3 different kinds, which I match here with 3 different colors. The first kind is the one of continuous text with vertical blanks of 5 lines. And you see that the text is broken and starts again at the same horizontal location, and sometimes even words are broken and we have hyphenation between segments. Sometimes Ollier will insert information between these segments, like here where we have a chess move, and sometimes these blanks will be diagonal. And what is interesting here is that we have 2 kinds of word breaks. Whenever they conform to hyphenation rules, he uses a hyphen. And when the word break is arbitrary, then there is no hyphen, like here. Sometimes he uses leaders. And this is a second kind of typographical arrangement, which is very close to Mallarmé. But it can take shapes, which can be symmetric. It can be holes inside text. These holes may push the text apart so that the text remains coherent, or they can hide the text. So, for example, here there are words missing. You have to reinvent the missing text. They can have organic forms, so they evolve among pages. They can evolve from being holes to being matter or something in between. And the third kind of typographical arrangements we find in fuzzy sets are narrow blocks, which appear always in pairs, and always the left part follows the narrative thread and the right part is arbitrary. Sometimes the right part is just a chess game. Alfred Bester uses typographical arrangement in a completely different purpose to express simultaneity. So here we are in a world of telepath called espers, and these telepaths communicate graphemically. And they all witness the same graphemes mentally. And this typographical arrangement, where time is the direction from top to bottom, shows their simultaneous thoughts. And I have drawn arrows to show the logical and syntactic order of words in these sentences, which are intermingled. And sometimes also these typographical arrangements correspond to gestures, so the gesture of thread medium. Damasio and use typographical arrangements in the text as universe metaphor. So in the case of La Ode du Contrevent of Damasio, you have the beginning of the book, the Genesis, where the same paragraph is repeated 5 times. In the first occurrence, you only have punctuation, which is like cosmic dust. And then matter is created, and you see that characters appear at the same locations where they are in the final paragraph, but in a selective way so that they form different words and different meanings. So you can read l'orgie fut vitesse, vent furtif. Here you can read l'origine fuse le pur ouvert, and finally you get à l'origine fut la vitesse, le pur mouvement furtif. To, a Japanese contemporary author, uses kanji characters as building blocks of the world of the narrator. In this world, you have paragraphs of decreasing length, starting from 150 to 1, and the narrator lives in this world and realizes that his or her world is shrinking. And here you see the final paragraphs of this short story. Jardin uses typographical arrangements to denote obsession. So here the same character. So here we are in the sans serif part of the book. Thinks of Manon, with whom he is in love. He opens a vase with Manon's perfume. These are his impressions by smelling the perfume. And he concludes that this vase, this perfume, contained the presence of Manon. And this presence is given by the form of the text. So to conclude, obvious βραχήσει de techni macra, ars longa vita brevis. We have shown just a few examples to illustrate these categories of our classification. There are books like the Book of Leaves by Danielewski or S by Abrams and Dawes, which are very rich in methods among those we have presented. We have rather focused on individual methods used in standard speculative fiction texts. We didn't dealt with innovative use of pre-existing graphemes at all, but our conclusion is that more than in any other literary domain, speculative fiction authors have transgressed graphemic and graphetic conventions by innovative, imaginative new ways to boldly go where no man has gone before. Thank you.